you so much. To our own Reverend Lisa, our senior minister, love and blessings to you today. And to Reverend Paul, we're blessing you, knowing that you are healing, and I expect you to be up and running about very shortly. And also to our LA Third family, and to all others who are a part of this morning's moment of inspiration. I can only imagine. Wonderful selection. And I'd like to begin with this today by saying to everyone this way, namaste. And I say that because we are shortly about to have a reopening all over, at least this state, because of other states have already opened up. And we'll be coming back together again. And I can only imagine what that is going to be like. And I'm trusting that as we embark upon this re-emergence, that all of our family have gotten their shots, that everyone has heeded the advice and they have taken one of the medications that have been available, that when we get back together, we learn to share a blessing as opposed to racing to do the hugs. So, and that's why I began today with namaste. If we learn that the divine in me reaches out and recognizes the divine within you. And that is much, much a greater way of greeting than for us to grab each other just momentarily. Awaken, sons of God. You know, when Reverend Gerald shared with me this topic, immediately I thought of a worship song that we used to sing in the old church many, many, many years ago. And it was, arise and shine and give God the glory. And we can only give God glory when we are awakened. So this is our moment. You know, today as I awakened and I became grateful for this new day, and as I looked outside, you know, I said, what a blessing, because, you know, typically in June, we have the June gloom, that we have this massive overcast that happens. The day is gray until sometime late in the afternoon, then all of a sudden the sun emerges. But this morning, the sun is out. And it's out and it's shining and it's bright and it is blessing each of us. So as we awaken and we see this, automatically we ought to have this sort of praise within our own mind that say, this is the day that God has made for me, and I shall rejoice and be glad therein. So as we go into our theme for the month, I'd like to reference one of the writings of Paul in a letter that he gave to the Ephesians. And he says this, awake thou that sleepest, and rise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. Awaken, thou that sleep. Let's come alive. Let's become conscious. Let's become aware. Let's stand up and receive the blessings that God has provided to each of us. Now, in this letter, Paul goes on to make a few other suggestions that I'd like to share. And he says this, to awake and to rise in the light of Christ is to be followers of God, to walk in love, to be not deceived by the vain words of men, to be filled with light, to speak to yourself with spiritual songs, and to give thanks always for the things unto God. And as I went through that list, one of the things that just sort of stood out for me was this idea of speaking to oneself with spiritual songs. Because here is indeed the power of affirmations to the awakening soul. To listen to a tune and to have a direct relationship to the lyrics of that song which you are listening to, and to understand that it is inherently a message for you. For instance, the one that we just listened to a moment ago by Tamla Mann, I Can Only Imagine. And it sort of implies us to really just sort of stretch our imagination and to use this gift of the Spirit to begin to visualize for ourselves the blessings that we would love to have the experience of, and to know that it is, in fact, our possibility as the children of God, that we've been empowered to draw greater good into our experience and into our circumstance. So along that line, thinking and receiving a spiritual song, I thought of two that always sort of come to mind when I'm in the midst of something, when I'm trying to move beyond something or draw something even closer to me. And one is entitled, I Surrender. And we know how often we need to let go and to let God, which was part of the experience that Daryl took us through this morning as he took us into our meditation. That we need to let go of everything and anything that would block us from allowing our good to penetrate our understanding, to shed greater light into our experience. Anything that denies us the idea that God being right where we are and blessing us, we need to let it go. And then there was another song so often as I move forward in my experiences that I think of, and it was one that was written by Ricky Byers, the musical director over at Agape, when she did this, and it was Use Me, O Lord. And I just absolutely love those lyrics, to use me because I stand by you and I'll abide in you. Show me what I must do. So oftentimes when we're in the fog of our experiences, when something is trying to rob us of our joy and our happiness, we need to speak into the consciousness of the self and say to Spirit, show me what I must do. Reveal it to me in a way that I can understand and I can receive, and empower me to move forward. But in order to have this level of affirmation and acceptance, we must be awake. You know, so often we are allowing ourselves to be dormant in the ignorance of one's understanding. Awakening doesn't necessarily always mean awakening from one's sleep, but also awakening from our dormancy, awakening from a place of stillness, awakening to a greater understanding and a greater realization of the light of Christ. So today and this month, as we go through this theme, you are invited to become conscious of the opportunity for you to express your divinity. And so in order for us to prepare ourselves for this great adventure of this month as an awakened son of God, I want you to just say this mantra to yourself. I happen to be the one. And I want you to repeat that and say it to yourself convincingly. And wherever you are, especially when I'd imagine that most of you are at home, say it aloud. Say it so not only do you hear it within your spirit, but also you hear it in your natural ear. I happen to be the one. And I want you to hold on to that. Know this, you are the one whom the Spirit has filled with its power, with its love and influence. So today you are invited to awaken to this understanding. Now, while in your dormancy, the seeds of your divinity have been nurtured and ingrained into your consciousness, so that when you become awakened, you allow yourself to begin to experience all of that understanding, that knowledge and power that Spirit has imparted unto you. You know, as we look out on nature, there are so many animals that they go to sleep and they hibernate. And while they hibernate, they are unconscious. But though unconscious, their minds are still active. And the same is true for us. While we are unconscious, our minds are active. So when we awaken, we come forward and then we're able to move, for instance, upon some of the dreams that we have, something that we've received as a very special message while we were asleep. But we cannot act upon that until we have awakened. Now, each of us are rich with the fruits of the Spirit. Yet so often we wander in ignorance. We're sort of like we are sleepwalking. We are in motion, but we're just not conscious of what it is that we are doing. I think of an instance, for instance, when the Bible speaks of a time when Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and he went up into the mountain to pray. And the scripture says that as he prayed, his countenance changed. However, Peter, James, and John, they were asleep. So they were unable to see the transformation that was taking place. However, when they awakened, the Bible said that they beheld him in his glory. In other words, they saw that from the time that they arrived at that moment to the time that they awakened, a transition had taken place, that there had been a change within Jesus. Now, this story, it reminds us of a couple of things. One, how we need to move to a quiet, solitary location for our own meditative purposes, away from all the distractions. And when we move away from our distractions, that means also we need to move away from our cell phones, because, oftentimes we want to quiet ourselves and still ourselves, but we have our cell phones with us and they don't tell us when they're going to go off. They just kind of go off. But just imagine for a moment, and the next time that you have separated yourself from everything and everyone, and you are attempting to have an alignment with the God within yourself, the Christ consciousness that is a part of yourself. Imagine illumination. However you perceive illumination, I want you to just imagine it. And with your eyes closed, see illumination all around you. And when you're able to see that, then speak with confidence of one in the presence of spirit. Now, when we can imagine illumination, and then without doubt speak into that illumined moment with confidence, once again, it reinforces the notion that truly we are the sons of God. Because there is an expectation that is very clear and very dear to us when we have that understanding, that there is a certain amount of spiritual understanding that is inherently ours. It comes with the understanding that we are the children of God. There is an expectation that this divine presence, this divine power is constantly feeding us of itself. And when we quiet ourselves, we become more comfortable and more understanding of it. And then we begin to test it. The example I just gave you was an instance where you're able to test it, to imagine illumination. See it, all illumination around you, then speak into that illumination that you see. Make a command upon the spirit, and then with great expectation, move away from it, expecting that word of yours to come alive. I was reading a story the other day, and it was in this book, Come Back and Beyond. And the author of this book is a guy by the name of Tim Story. Now, Tim is an author. He's a motivational speaker. He's a minister of sorts. And in this book, he shares one of many stories, but this one in particular, he talks about a time when he was in Oakland, and friends of his were part of the Oakland Raiders. And a couple of the players came to him who he knew personally, and they had requested that he began a Bible study for the Raiders team. And he was all excited about it, and he was, of course, ready to do it. And so he gave them a date on which they could come to his location. It was on a Monday. He said, bring the guys over on a Monday, and we would start this Bible study. Well, Monday came around and his friends came, but there were only maybe another 10 players that came along with them. And he said that when they entered in, he could just look at the expressions on their face, and the expressions were telegraphing, why in the world did they drag me into this? This was not something that they felt confident about experiencing. There was no real expectation of good coming from this. And that was because they didn't see themselves in a particular spiritual way. So he set out and he began to start talking. And he said that the more he talked, the more disappointment came over the face of the individuals that were there. So then he asked everyone to stand up. And he said when he made that request, only 2 of the people stood up. So he said what he had to do then is he had to get within himself. He had to then begin to speak within himself. And he began to speak until he felt the presence of God at work within him. And when he felt the presence of God at work within him, then he began to speak to them as directed by the Spirit. And as the day went on, all of a sudden now, everyone in the room was up and they were clapping and they were cheering and everyone was having a good time. And they seemed as though all of a sudden they were all happy that they had come. He had awakened something within them. It was there all the time, unbeknownst to them. But he was the catalyst that Spirit used to awaken with them an understanding of their divinity as they searched the scripture. The following Monday, when they came back, this time there were over 30 players that came. He had awakened a seed within that first 10. That seed that he had awakened in that first 10 went back into the team, and all of a sudden it was contagious. Something that they had received, some anointing, some special word, some special insight had penetrated the minds of these football players, a group that not necessarily were interested in being a part of a Bible study. Now all of a sudden they were racing to the door to be a part of this experience. Okay, now he has a bigger audience. And once again, he begins to allow the Spirit to speak through him, to guide and direct him in what it is he needed to do. And likewise, with the first 10, now he began to awaken within over 30 of these players the seeds of divinity that is planted within us all. This understanding that we all are the sons of God, albeit we've been wandering in darkness. We've been wandering in our ignorance. We've been sleepwalking. And now here in this moment, they are now awakened. Then the team, this 30 plus players, after this experience, they go back. And they go back into the organization. Now all of a sudden, a renaissance begins to take place in the organization. Things begin to change. There are not so many player grievances. Everyone has a whole different attitude. Now, mass numbers of the organization want to come and be a part of this Bible study. It was all about perception in the beginning. Something that they thought was one thing began to be another. He was the catalyst for change. God used him to awaken within this ball team the understanding that they are the sons of God, and as sons of God, joint heirs with Jesus Christ, and therefore that they are powerful spiritual beings. Now, this is the truth about us all. Whether we are aware of it or not, doesn't deny that that is the truth. Somewhere along our journey, we enter into a place, we enter into the life of someone else, we enter into a situation. And entering into that moment, We hear that special word that unlocks us to feel that special presence that feeds into our understanding the greater realization of truth. And when all of that comes forward within us, we become awake, we become aware, and then we go forth into our lives ready to demonstrate. Now, today is that day for us. Today is the start of a brand new opportunity. We're starting out in June. We have a whole month in front of us to each day to become more awakened and aware of our power and our potential, to realize that it is all before us, awaiting our awareness to move forward, to seize it, and to do something with it. The Bible speaks of a similar story in the life of one who became one of its greatest writers, and that was, it talks about Saul of Tarsus and the experience he had on the road to Damascus. Now, Saul was a tax collector. He was sort of a sheriff type, and he just took great pleasure in the persecuting of the Jews who believed in Jesus Christ. He was an intellectual. He had been trained in all the great rabbinical schools of the time. He was a Roman, even though he was Jewish. He was born a Roman, and therefore he was part of the upper class. So he was very well educated. Now, but all of a sudden, as he went through his life persecuting these individuals, at one moment he had a life-altering experience. One day on the road to Damascus, to collect and to persecute, he was blinded by a bright light. And a voice spoke through the light and called him by his name and said, "Why do you persecute me?" And this was something entirely different, I would imagine, for him, because this was not the spiritual philosophy that he was sort of raised upon. This was just something brand new and so unexpected that here you are on your way to do something that gave you a whole lot of happiness, but you are stopped and you are blinded. But in this light that is blinding you, a voice is speaking to you directly, and only you can hear the voice. Everyone else that's with you hears nothing. It's a very personal experience. But this experience was so life-altering that it changed his approach. It changed his philosophy. It changed the way he treated people. And it brought him to become a believer of the gospel. And as a result of that experience, this one man probably wrote more books throughout the New Testament than any other writer. And today, whether you are reading Corinthians, whether you're reading Romans, whether you're reading Hebrews, whether you're reading Philippians, whether you're reading Ephesians, all of these contain a lot of his letters. And all of these talk about his personal experience with the Christ light. Imagine. Now, this was his experience. Many of us may have similar experiences in terms of coming awake of our true nature and our identity with the Christ within ourselves. A lot of us were in situations that we may not like, confronted with difficulties that tend to try to take away our happiness, whether it's sickness, whether it's financial, whether it's personal, whatever. We're confronted by a whole multitude of things. And we're oftentimes looking for some relief. And in our search for relief, many of us feel that we need to go in prayer. And as a part of that prayer, we are begging, we're negotiating, and we're talking to God as a powerless being. You know, it's sort of like, and I've said this so often, it's like asking God for something that you've already been given. But through our ignorance, we don't realize that we already have the gifts. In the midst of our difficulty, rather than to look at the difficulty and tell it it has no power, we empower it. When situations come and they take our happiness away, rather than to grab it back, we continue to push it away because we don't have an expectation that God has anointed us with that which we need to move beyond this situation. It's like as I began the lesson today with just the statement of the namaste, very simple word that just recognized the divinity within each other. And when we can recognize the divinity within each other, we have a higher appreciation for each other. But we cannot recognize that in someone else when we have yet to recognize it within ourselves. I cannot see you as the Son of God, the joint heir with Christ, one filled with all the gifts of the Spirit, until I've seen it within myself. Because as I've seen it within myself, I recognize that God has no respecter of person. And therefore, when it sends out blessings, it sends them out abundantly and to all who are willing to believe and to accept. In this instance of Paul's experience on this road to Damascus, he awakened from his ignorance into the light of Christ. He learned that the persecution of innocent people were wrong. He learned that the talents that he had, God had a greater job for him. With his intellectual understanding, there was a need for a writer, a prolific writer, to write all of these books of the gospel. And he was selected for just that task in this moment. We never know what's in front of us, what potential there is in store for us. But we should always be moving forward in life from a place of expectancy. And just stop on that word for a moment. What is your expectation for today? Forget about tomorrow, next week, the following weeks of the month. What is your expectation of today? You know, as one writer put it, eyes have not seen, ears have not heard, nor has it been yet revealed into the hearts and the minds of men the good that God has in store for them that love him. I can only imagine. And that's one of the greatest tools that Spirit has given us, the ability to imagine, to awaken and to see ourselves in a greater light, to awaken and to see ourselves with changed circumstances, to imagine a life that is whole, perfect, and complete, to imagine an instance of divine restoration that has taken place in one's body. If only we were willing to awaken and to receive the gifts. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to say this once again. I happen to be the one. I happen to be the one. Which one is that? The one who is called. The one whose gifts have been revealed. The one who stands in his glory. I happen to be that one. And today is that day. Not just for me, but for all of us. Today is the day that we are empowered to stand in our glory. Today is the day that we open ourselves up for the flood of divine gifts that reveal themselves into our understanding. Today is the day that we take the shackles off of our consciousness and allow it to expand. Today is the day to see ourselves as God has always beheld us. Today is the day that we appreciate ourselves and people everywhere as the children of God, the joint heirs of Christ, empowered to do the impossible, to think the unthinkable, to allow that seed of greatness that had been implanted within us from the very foundation of our lives to just all of a sudden now grow and grow and grow. Today's that day. This is that moment. It's up to you to seize it or to let it go. Isn't it so wonderful? God has given us the option, and it's up to us to choose. Life is just our wonderful experiment. And we're given the opportunity to try and to do so many wonderful things in the laboratories of our minds, because that's where everything begins. Every experience that we have ever had or shall ever have all began as an idea in our consciousness. And we either empower that idea or we bury that idea. We empower that idea when we awaken to the understanding that, yeah, I am the Son of God. And this idea that has all of a sudden come to the forefront of my consciousness is something that I believe that I can do. And now I set forth to do it, because that idea is just a seed. And just like every seed, everything necessary for its unfoldment is within it. Everything. We just need to let it grow. And that's your task. The seed of your perfection is within you. Let it grow. The seed of your greatness is within you. Let it grow. The seed of your creative imagination is within you. Let it grow. The seed of power is within you. Let it grow. Awaken, sons of God. Peace and blessings to all of you. Namaste.